Old birds. Hazard level A, they're indestructible, damage ranges from 30 to insta-kill, max spawn is 20, and they're most commonly found on Embryon. Old birds have 3 phases: roaming, flying, and alerted. Old birds spawn a little differently than other entities. When you first land on a moon, the game predicts how many old birds will spawn, then it will spawn that many inactive old birds around the map. Once it's time to spawn an old bird, it will take over a random inactive old bird. Keep in mind that there's no specific time they become active. Old birds use the same spawn function as every other outdoor enemy, the only difference is that they take over inactive old birds when it's time to spawn. Since the game predicts how many old birds will spawn, this means that at some point during your run, every inactive old bird will become active. More old birds can spawn, but that will only happen if enough enemies die to free up space, in which case the old bird will just poof into existence. Also, if you pull the apparatus at any point, this will activate every old bird. When an old bird activates, it will begin its roaming phase. Old birds adapt the standard AI search routine with a search precision of 5. If you don't know how this function works, I've explained it in depth in my Forest Keepers video. However, old birds use this function a little differently. The moment they enter this phase, they draw a circle around them 36 units out and will slowly march to each node in this circle. Once they've checked off every node in this circle, this will send them into phase 2. When an old bird enters this phase, it will fly straight up into the air, select a random node, and fly straight towards it. You'll know an old bird is flying if it sounds like there's an airplane in the sky. While the old bird is flying, it has a field of view of 35 degrees and looks down at a 55-degree angle as shown on screen. If an old bird spots you while in this phase, it will fly in your direction, and once it's above you, it'll drop straight down. If it lands on you, it can do up to 70 damage, then it will enter phase 3. In this phase, old birds cannot spot you if you're crouching, even if you're walking. As long as you're crouched, they cannot see you, so if an old bird is flying, either crouch or stay behind it. If you notice one landing on you, just sprint behind it and it should go back into phase 1 when it lands. If the old bird doesn't spot any players by the time it gets to its selected node, it will drop straight down onto the node and return to phase 1. While the old bird is on the ground, it has a field of view a little different than most enemies. Most enemies have a field of view that look like a cone, but old birds have a field of view shaped like a sphere, which is the biggest field of view out of every enemy in the game. Just to show you how big this sphere is, if an old bird is standing by the ship on Embryon, it can see pretty much all the way to main entrance. And on Artifice, if an old bird is standing near the ship, it can see pretty much the entire map. Also, its eyes are not on its head, they're actually in between its ankles, so as long as you can't see its ankles, it cannot see you. If an old bird spots you, this will trigger phase 3. Before I explain phase 3, I want to give a huge shout out to CHBoo for decompiling old birds, putting all their information on a doc, and accurately explaining every detail. I also want to shout out Geo and Addy for the beautiful field of view visuals, and finally, a huge thanks to the other devs in my server for some extra help on this video. These videos would not exist if it wasn't for them. If you're not already in my Discord, it's linked in the description. Join up and show them some love. As soon as an old bird enters this phase, its spotlight will turn on and its field of view will change to the standard cone, which covers a much smaller area than the sphere. Also, if you're wondering how I'm flying, I'm using Imperium by Joswell. This feature just came out today. I'll link it in the description. Phase 3 has 2 sub-phases, spotted and alerted. When an old bird first spots you, it'll turn on its spotlight, indicating it's entered sub-phase 1. The old bird will slow down and begin walking towards the area it spotted you. Once it gets to that location, it'll go back to its normal speed and continue searching for you for 10 seconds. After the 10-second timer, its spotlight will turn off, indicating that it's returned to its roaming phase. The best way of dealing with an old bird during this phase is to either break line of sight or stay behind the old bird until it returns to its roaming phase. Old birds use an alert meter to tell them whether to stay in this phase or advance into the next one. I won't be explaining every detail of this meter. All you have to know is that the old bird will advance into the next subphase if you're in its field of view for about a second and a half. If you're crouching, this can buy you up to an extra second or 2 before it advances, but in my personal experience, you're better off sprinting to cover the moment its spotlight turns on. If you're in the old bird's field of view too long, this will send it into sub-phase 2. You'll know an old bird is in this phase because it will move much faster and start playing a series of random sound effects, including a siren and, my personal favorite, a baby crying. In this phase, old birds have 3 different behaviors that all depend on how far they are from you. If you're outside of this bubble, it will charge straight for you, gradually speeding up. If you're inside this bubble, it'll shoot anywhere between 6 and 15 missiles. The cooldown on this attack is between 2 and 5 seconds. Missiles are very unpredictable because of how much they rotate in the air, but regardless of how much they rotate, they're still pretty easy to avoid by sprinting to the side. When a missile connects with an object, it will cause an explosion, which will knock back anything in close proximity. The closer you are to the missile, the further you'll get knocked back. Missiles will always do 30 damage, even if they directly hit you. However, missiles can insta-kill you, but this will only happen if the missile connects with the floor or wall literally right next to you. Just to clarify, if a missile hits anywhere around you, it'll do 30 damage. If it directly hits you, it'll also do 30 damage. But if it explodes literally right next to you, this will insta-kill you. So if you're carrying a lot of weight, it might be a good idea to jump to avoid getting insta-killed. If you're within this bubble of the old bird, this will trigger the old bird to grab. When an old bird reaches down to grab, it'll stay in this position for 1.5 seconds. You can still get grabbed while the old bird is frozen in this position, but you'd literally need to jump into its claw. If an old bird successfully grabs you, it'll proceed to burn you to death for 1.5 seconds. Once you've been grabbed, you cannot be saved even if you stun the old bird. Stunning the old bird will freeze it for 9 seconds. Cooldown on this attack is about 5 seconds. This attack is very easy to avoid even if you're standing right by the old bird. Its claw will always be on its right arm and it tries to grab anything near its right leg, so as long as you're not directly in front of its right leg, it will not grab you. Purposely triggering this animation is a great way to buy you some time to get away from the old bird. The best way of doing this is to sprint past one of its legs, and as soon as the animation triggers, run away. Also, be careful trying to do this because old birds will do 30 damage every time they step on you. If you're able to break line of sight, it'll search the last place it saw you. 10 seconds after reaching that location, it'll return to phase 1. Everything I've just explained is how old birds will behave if they spot a player, forest keeper, eyeless dog, mimic, or baboon hawk. The only exception is when an old bird is flying, in which case it only looks for players. So having an old bird on your map is pretty nice considering they usually wipe out a lot of other enemies. When it comes to playing against old birds, I suggest staying far away from them or staying behind them to prevent triggering their aggro phase. If one targets you, make sure you save your stamina and use it to dodge missiles. You can also try using the knockback from the missiles to help you get to where you're trying to go. And if you're cracked, you can try triggering the old bird's grab animation to buy you some time, like I mentioned earlier. I found that one of the best ways to counter old birds is to charge them when they charge you, trigger their grab animation as you run past them, then find cover. Usually, they'll continue moving forward once their grab animation finishes, which gives you some extra time to hide. I also found that there's a sweet spot right in front of the old bird where it won't shoot missiles at you, allowing you to walk it back, but I wouldn't recommend doing this unless you have no other choice. Don't worry about making noise because they can't hear you, and don't bother trying to kill it because the only way an old bird can die is from an earthworm. We're almost at 40,000 subscribers. Thank you for all the support you guys have shown me this year. I'm streaming on Twitch where you can interact with my game. You can literally spawn items in my hand, you can spawn enemies in my game, and do so much more. Click the first link in the description and follow me. And if I'm not live, check out my masterclass series where I'm explaining how every mechanic in Lethal Company is coded.